I love some of the conflicts that you look at because they're not resolvable. Like one of the things that struck me certainly was that do you live true to your personal dreams, as you say, or do you do what others expect of you? Mike, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Hi, Pat. Thank you so much. I was born into a family of engineers, auto mechanics, farm mechanics. One of my uncles went quit a deadbeat job and went back to college, got a double E degree, electrical engineering, and he developed on a team that developed the scanners at IBM for barcode scanning that we all use now. So I just basically wanted to be Bill Steele, and went to engineering school at Georgia Tech, and got my degree, but I found that I was being trained for a profession rather than being educated in a broader sense. I wasn't able to take philosophy and humanities and arts that I was interested in. So that was a big background to starting a publishing business on the great ideas of history. And this is economics, philosophy, science, religion, political thought, and others. When I was about 40 years old, we were doing a series of tapes on the moral problems of our age. And I had this aha moment. You might describe it as a bump in the road, but it was a transitional point for me because I realized the problems we were discussing. And in this case, particularly, there's war and terrorism, drugs and alcohol, love and sexuality, but abortion and euthanasia was one. And I realized this is not a problem like I understand a problem to be, which is, you can find an answer. There's a formula, there's an algorithm, there's a structured decision-making process. You break things down into parts and solve the parts. All these things I was trained to do as an engineer. And that problem was, what I saw was that there were multiple truths in play that were in conflict, and you cannot have all those truths at once. You cannot realize them all at once. And so this is what became the title of my book, Deep Trade-Offs. I came to name it after 20 more years of thinking about it and seeing multiple examples in papers, newspapers and things that I read, of trade-offs that seem to be inarticulate. They're beneath our consciousness. We're making choices about things that are in conflict without realizing we're doing so. As an example, focus and sensitivity. I'm highly focused. People can walk in the room while I'm working and I don't know that they're there. My son had an attention disorder, and a psychologist helped me understand his problem was executive function, inability to control his attention. So he's easily distracted, right? I was not able to be distracted because I was focused. He's easily distracted. And so this is attention that's constantly in play. Most of us never recognized it and chosen either path, much less be aware of it. Right. So this is the idea of deep trade-offs, and I've spent 20 years thinking about it, and I've written my first book about it.
Your book is fascinating. I really love this book. There's so many things. One of the things I loved about it, many things, but I love a lot of the quotes that you came up with. And you had one quote from Arthur C. Clarke, who wrote my favorite book of all time. Now, my book that I love is not in your book, but let me tell you a little bit about it because it really goes to these um, unsolvable dynamics that we face in this human journey. The
Yes.
book is called The City in the Stars, and it's about two different civilizations that took two different paths. One took a path of technology and instant gratification. One took a very human path where communication is telepathic. And they live a much more agrarian life. They live about 300 years, but they die. And in the technological society, there's no death. You go back into the computer and you come up again. And in this technological society, the founders created a soul that would appear periodically, or several souls, called a unique, somebody who'd never been born, so was never subject to the collective fear, beliefs, um, or roles that were that dictated that society. And this is the story of Alvin, one of those uniques who, through his curiosity and lack of constricture to all these mores of the day, goes off and discovers the other society, and he changes the future of humanity as a result.
Right.
Great book. But in reading your book, it reminded me of that. And I love some of the conflicts that you look at because they're not resolvable. Like one of the things that struck me certainly was that do you live true to your personal dreams, as you say, or do you do what others expect of you?
Right. Chapter one is, as I frame it, is on striving or peace. We all say we want peace, but we fight and we strive, and there are things that are worth striving for, worth fighting over, like subjection or survival. Most of us will fight to survive.
Hmm.
Most of us will lie in order to survive. We say that truth may be a high value, but we'll deceive people in order to survive, in order to avoid subjection, in order to provide joy. We lie to our kids about Santa Claus, but there's a good reason to do it. It provides joy. We lie to people in order not to harm them. If it's a bad meal that they service and you really don't like it, you may hide that truth because it's not necessary to harm somebody with that truth. So, there's truth and deception. That's the third chapter, actually. But the first one is peace and striving. And so that issue comes up, what's worth striving for? And people tell us very clearly at the end of their lives, it's having lived authentically according to what they value, not having somebody else tell them what they should do. So in the context of discussing this tension between accommodating, accepting, forgiving, and objecting, resisting, being an activist, demonstrating, etc., those are choices we're always making. What do we accept? What we do challenge? What do we try to do? What do we let alone? And I think most of us are highly unaware of that at any given moment.
If we choose striving, are we inherently setting ourselves up for conflict?
Well, conflict is a normal part of the human condition. It's another big point that I try to make is that anybody expects there to be conflict is expecting what never was and never will be, as Thomas Jefferson said about something else that I don't recall at the time. But we have conflicts with even our most intimate relationships. It is crazy to think that we need to agree with somebody before we can have a relationship with them. So the conclusion from that is that relationships come first. We're not going to persuade anybody, and they're not going to persuade us if we're hostile and confrontational. People are loved into change, not shoved into it. So if you're trying to get somebody else to change, the first step is develop a relationship so they trust you and respect you and are willing to listen to what you have to say. And vice versa. You should do that for them and be willing to change. All of us are capable of change. As one observation says, if you're not capable of change, you're either perfect or you're dead. And I know we're not dead, and I think we're not perfect. So we should not have so much confidence in 100% confidence in what we believe to be true. Maybe it's 70, 80%, because there are other competing truths that may work better in a particular situation.
I think change is an inherent part of the human journey. And I think that we either adapt to change in small increments, or if we resist change for a long period of time, we're looking at a cataclysmic change because all
Exactly.
this is built up, whether it's in relationships and society. So it would behoove us to have open minds, wouldn't it?
Yes, I think you don't have to think very hard or look very hard to see that that's true. Things are going to change. And you also might say it'd be pretty boring if it weren't that way. I don't think I'd want to live in a world that didn't change.
Yeah, one of the quotes from your book, which talks about change to some degree, is from Brene Brown, and you write, "When we make the choice to dare greatly, we sign up to get our asses kicked. We can choose courage or we can choose comfort, but we can't have both, not at the same time."
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, she's so terrific in talking about vulnerability, and I think that's the main thrust of her work. But that quote is articulating nearly perfectly the dichotomy that I'm trying to examine, which is that we can sign up to get our asses kicked and strive and maybe accomplish things. That's really what people most respect, is people who suffer for a worthy cause, right? Or we can go to the couch, we can be passive. We think that'll bring us happiness, but actually the research says otherwise, that we find happiness in engagement and activity, not in passivity.
Well, that goes to flow, which you quote also, and I think that it is in that striving to be better, to learn more, to focus, and to be in the moment that we do find satisfaction.
Absolutely. Life is activity. One philosopher I quote says, the enemy is inactivity. Another one is a doctor who says, life is motion. You stop moving and you decline and die. So I thoroughly embrace this idea that happiness is not being relaxed with a drink in your hand and a TV in front of you. It's entertainment. I like to do that. I need it every once in a while. But it's not where we really find fulfillment.
Now, well, that goes to happiness versus joy. Happiness is external, joy is internal. And I think you find joy in flow, in activity, in doing and creating.
Yes, very much.
Talk a little bit about the second chapter in your book, if you would.
You mentioned Arthur C. Clarke, and science fiction is a wonderful way of exhibiting the imagination. So chapter number 2 is about the conflict between ideals and reality. Ideology is a very short step away from ideals, the way that we think the world ought to be. And we have so many varieties of ideology, of imagination about what should happen. And they cannot be realized. First of all, they're in conflict. We cannot be fully free and fully equal. People think that we ought to have ultimate equality, but what you have to do to freedom to accomplish that is unacceptable. And if we let people be completely free, people are going to come out so many different outcomes, that we don't tolerate that either. So how do you balance liberty and equality? So the chapter 2 is really looking more specifically at what is reality? What should we expect of reality? It's certainly not perfection, right? We can see perfection in our dreams. We may try to get closer to that. That's the reason for education and for a lot of the striving that we do, that we've already talked about. But we needn't fool ourselves that we're going to create a utopia on earth. Everyone that's tried that has failed. And we have to accept really a level of tragedy. Some literary types would call it, or fallenness, as religious types would call it. We live in an imperfect world. And the gap, as James Baldwin says, a great novelist, we're trapped between what is and what ought to be.
And yet each and every one of us will have a different subjective what ought to be.
Exactly. And so this is a source of the ultimate, what am I trying to say? Inevitable conflict.
Yeah.
We talked about earlier, anyone who thinks that there should not be conflict and that there's a problem if there's conflict has really not thought hard about it.
You brought up perfectionism, and I think perfectionism also has its good and bad points. It's wonderful to strive, and yet perfectionism can be self-destructive, don't you think?
Yeah, exactly. In Wall Street, they have a term that the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
You're not willing to accept the good and get it, in big tent areas where, like in politics or religion, you need to accept different views, or you're going to ultimately have a minority of one. And even one person sometimes has different opinions on any particular topic, right? So that's the nature of humanity. We differ, we disagree. We're not going to achieve agreement, but we can channel our disagreement into more productive ends.
How do you open discussion to get people away from their often rigid beliefs to even examine a greater world of possibility?
I think we start with understanding that our belief systems lock us into a way of seeing the world, and we generally test what we experience against that belief system. We reject things that don't fit into that belief system, and we accept things that do. Again, we see what we wish to see, and we reject what we don't want to see, sometimes in a level of blindness. We literally don't see things that we can't accept or don't want. So first, we start with the idea that we don't have it right. We need to listen to other people. Our opponents or adversaries are the ones that are most likely to be accurate in telling us what's wrong with what we think. So we start with ourselves. We question. We accept criticism. But instead of telling and directing and objecting and using rational language about not this, there's negating language, there's rational language that generally signals to people that you're unreceptive to how they feel and understand things. They respond better to how you make them feel, as the poet Maya Angelou said. They may forget what you said, but they won't forget how you made them feel. So this is the way our brain works, and a lot of it is subconscious. Psychologist Jonathan Haidt really taught me a lot about this in his book about happiness. And he says there's about 80% of our brain function we're not aware of. Mm-hmm. The intuition, habits, intuition, and other instincts. As he says, about 80% of our brain function. And the metaphor he uses is like an Indian rider on an elephant. The rider is the rational brain. The elephant is the subconscious brain. The rider's trying to direct the elephant where he wants it to go, but the elephant may have other ideas. Right? And so I don't know how you measure that, and maybe it's a metaphorical measurement, but his point is there's a lot going on that urges us, that compels us, that is underneath our rational thought. We think we're looking and making impartial decisions. We're actually not. We're looking and picking evidence to support what we already believe.
Well, that goes to the story, again, with an elephant, of the three men. And one person, touches the trunk and sees one thing. One person touches another part of the animal, sees another. One person touches, I don't know, the tail. And as a result, they have three totally different stories because they, quote unquote, see something totally different.
It's wonderful. Yeah. I mentioned that in the book in discussing truth. The third chapter, we've already talked about peace and striving and reality and imagination. The third one is on truth and deception. We all think we're for the truth, but we deceive ourselves and we deceive other people, sometimes for good reason, so we won't harm them. We touched on that. But sometimes it's because we're not realizing we're not seeing the big truth. We're seeing our frame of truth, our worldview, our cognitive structure that I alluded to a moment ago about how we're fitting things into or not. So, yes, we see things through frames, and there's big opportunity to enlarge those frames.
Is there such a thing as truth?
Oh, gee, that's above my pay grade, but I'll take a shot at what I think about it. It's very clear that there are very different versions of truth. Okay. Let me put it this way. If I were to say, what is the meaning of life? We might be here till next week arguing over it and trying to distill it to an answer. But if I ask you instead, where do you find meaning? Well, you may have a bunch of answers. I may have a bunch of different answers, and they may all be true. Some more true for you than for me, but that's not debatable, really. There are different forms of truth. And so there's definitely various subjective truths. The argument then becomes down to, is there an objective truth with a capital T? And the way I like to think of that, the way I presented the book, is that things we can agree on through experiment and observation and logical testing can be accepted as objective truth. That's really the method of science. And so I accept that there are objective truths about the world that science discovers. Beyond that, we have to be skeptical that we have any hold on truth and understand that that's why it's not knowledge, it's faith. I may accept that it's better to be kind to people than to be mean to them or hostile to them, but it's hard to prove. And a lot of things that are most important to us are not measurable. They're not responsive to science. Love, friendship, hope, imagination, they're immaterial, they're ethereal. And I don't think we have scientific methods that will get us to that kind of capital T truth.
No, that is exactly what came to my mind as you were talking about scientific methods. I was thinking about walking in a forest or putting your feet in a stream. That's very experiential, and there's deep, pervasive, unchanging truth in that experience. But you can't prove it. You can't touch it.
it's very personal. It might be a personal truth. There may be other people without nerves in their feet that put their feet in there and don't experience that. So
Yeah,
it's not
very
their
true.
truth, right? So we have to be careful about what we claim to be universal.
Does intuition come into play in looking for truth?
It does. I think it's generally the way a lot of us operate is that we have our, again, subconscious, inattentive ways of thinking about things. And we're used to thinking that way and don't often challenge it. So those are what I call intuitions. You can get into subtleties about the difference between intuition and imagination and, instinct. I know I've had someone challenged me about the difference between instinct and intuition. I don't make a great differentiation between those two. They're both subconscious things that are going on that compel our behavior.
I would say instinct, that was very present moment, whereas I think intuition suggests a future path or a
Yes.
decision.
Yeah, that may be true. I haven't worked all of that out. To me, they're very similar, and I use the terms interchangeably, but that doesn't mean I'm right.
One of the things you talk about is reframing an issue. And how do you go about reframing an issue when one group of people are emotionally attached to a truth and another group of people see a more scientific perspective?
One thing I like to say is that we start out with relationships and then agreement follows. You have to, you don't shove people into change, you love them into it. And so if you're not don't have a relationship to build on, if people don't trust you, they're not going to listen, particularly if you're criticizing them. And so I think one way to start with people who are emotionally attached to one side or the other is to build some connection with them, have some laughter together, see a concert together, play golf together, talk about your kids together, talk about things that are not about whatever's being disagreed, a moral issue, a political or religious or something else controversial. And build on that connection. So even if you're fiercely opposed to somebody and you can't resolve it, you can come out of it with a relationship that says, I understand a little bit better why Pat, you think that intuition and what was the other one we were talking about?
Um, intuition.
Intuition.
Oh,
I've
and
dropped it now. Whether they're the same thing or not, right?
yeah.
I used to
Oh,
work with a lady who had these emotional experiences. She would describe traveling outside of her body. I mean, literally, I left my body, I went there and I did this, I saw this. And I worked with her a long time. I trust her terrifically. And I don't understand this. I don't know how I came to interpret it as a dream or some kind of psychological effect. But that's not the way she would say it, not the words that she would use. So one way of respecting people is to find the words that they would use to describe their own point of view, not a scarecrow, that you topple. It's a distortion and exaggeration of what they think. Find the terms that they would say, yes, I would describe myself that way. If I had thought of it, those are the words I would use. Then you're on a fair starting point to try to reconcile difference.
Yeah, I think one-on-one, we essentially fill the other person's piggy bank with emotional bonuses. I hear you, I see you, I believe you, that type of thing. And
Yes.
then when you hit a bump in the road of some sort, you have that emotional bank against which you can withdraw to disagree, agree to disagree, wherever you take the discussion. But I think part of the problem we have is we don't have those personal relationships as much anymore where we can, fill that emotional piggy bank, if you will. We're fractured, we're online, where people are firmly in one camp or another, and there's no building of trust or positive discourse at all, it seems.
Yes, I think this is a terrific topic. The first recommendation in my chapter 4 about what to do about this is to do these things in person, because we
Mhm.
treat people differently when we're right in front of us. You won't be nearly as harsh and as critical as some people feel free to do online, which I think is horrible. And I don't understand why people find joy and pleasure in being that harsh to people. But it's hard to do it in person. So that's one place to start. this emotional banking that you're talking about is the way I think about my marriage. I've been married 43 years, and we sometimes don't agree about something, but I know that there's 43 years of history. I love her, and we'll get through this. And there's this huge emotional bank there that protects us against disagreement in the moment. What I tell young people when they ask about advice about getting married or something, I say, learn to manage conflict and try not to use the words always and never, because that changes it from a conflict about a particular event, something you're disagreeing on, to a personal matter. Pat, you always do this. Pat, you never do that. Well, that's an attack on Pat, and it's personal and it opens old wounds. And so the emotional bank keeps us from doing that. I think people that are skilled at conflict resolution avoid attacking that bank.
Well, that always never paradigm, it's very black and white. And I think the reality of life is it's very gray.
Yes. This is
So
the point of trade-offs. It's very
absolutely.
gray. Yeah.
And this goes back to our discussion of truth. What is truth? Who has the handle on truth? I don't know that any of us do. So how in the world can we stake out these black and white claims where there's no truth in either one? I think there's more truth in the gray, if truth with a small t, perhaps.
Well, I left a religious tradition that told me what the truth was and that I needed to accept it, and I didn't like it. And so I joined one that respects conscience. And I don't like to be told what I should believe. I may come along and believe it if someone loves me into it, right? But I'm with you. I think people's dignity and conscience ought to be respected. Trust, we were mentioning that earlier. How do we build trust? I had an interesting experience about 2 weeks ago. My wife and I were out on a walk in our neighborhood, talking to another friend that we sometimes encounter. We actually met them on a walk. We now go to dinner in each other's homes. So we saw one of these guys were standing in the street talking to David, and another guy comes out of his house. He's an architect that lives locally. And he said, in the course of conversation, he said, my grandmother lived down the block here, and she would say, this used to be a nice neighborhood. Well, it's a prosperous area of Nashville. The homes are nice and all that kind of thing. What he said was that when it was hot and the homes were hot in the summer, they didn't have air conditioning. They would go out in their yards, sit in chairs, let the children play with each other. And that's how they got to know each other. That's what she meant by a nice neighborhood. And this guy is an architect. He said in the mid 20th century, porches went around to decks on the back of the house. Televisions came along that kept people inside. And so the sense of community is interrupted, is fractured by those developments. And so I kind of like the grandmother's way of thinking that a nice neighborhood is one that's friendly and people know each other, rely on each other, and trust each other.
We didn't have automatic garage door openers back then,
Exactly. Right on point.
But it's really true. I mean, go to any suburban neighborhood, you zap the door open, you pull in, you close the door. You can live there for 20 years and not know your neighbors.
Yes, that's right.
It's somewhat terrifying.
It takes effort. I live in the community with an HOA, and part of what we're working on is intentionally introducing new people, getting activities for people to get to know one another. And I think there's high purpose in that.
I just interviewed somebody recently who is in a cooperative community. This sounds like a commune. It is not. Everybody owns their own house, but part of the HOA rules, if you will, is that they have to communicate and together govern this little enclave of houses. And they actually had a lot of trouble with this. They had to go through conflict resolution classes and all sorts of things in order to start creating a cohesive community. And that community, over time, as you've been saying, was built on all these little efforts of trust, so that when you hit a bump, there was goodwill there. And people would find a way to resolve it. But that just doesn't happen in today's communities because we don't have that degree of interaction.
One way of thinking about that is that's the dynamic behind tribes. If you look at nature and civilization, and this is a trade-off for way in the future, cities and state of nature, people have different ideals about which one is better and where they would like to live. But how did we come to live in communities? And I think it's pretty clear that tribes are based on mutual trust, and distrust of foreigners is the obverse of that. It's the opposite side of the coin. And so we live in a more connected, universal world. We have principles that we think apply to everybody, not just to our tribe. It's easy to see religious traditions that have rules for themselves and different rules for other people. So there's a real question about how big is our tribe? Is it the whole of humanity? Is it the people in my household, or is it somewhere in between? Those are hard questions because we can't know everybody, obviously. But trust is a critical, it's a non-scientific element. Again, back to the discussion about what is truth. Do we find it in subjective feelings or in objective reason? And trust, pretty clearly to me, is in the realm of feelings, and it has to be cultivated. And the job is not going to be done by law or reason, investigation, or experiment.
How do we go about cultivating a narrative that we can all buy into?
I think we don't. Ultimately, can't find one narrative that we're all going to buy into. We see the world differently. I have Muslim friends. I have Hindu friends. They're dear friends. They're wonderful people. They do not need to see the world I do as a Christian, and vice versa.
So what
So
binds you together? What binds you?
I think we have mutual interests. Sometimes it's food. They
Mm-hmm.
share their food with me, and I love it. And I've had a wonderful experience. They're curious about me. They want to know why I think this, or and I want to know why they think a certain way. It's variety. It's color. It's vivid difference, and I cherish it. But if we were to try to enforce uniformity on that, or universal understanding of things, it would ruin it. I think ultimately it can't be done. So we have to draw boundaries around some of these things, what we're going to agree on, how that's going to apply, where we're going to work on those rules, and where different rules apply.
Or could the narrative be that you so appreciate the differences in each other?
Could be, yeah. And sometimes we don't like the differences. Back to trade-offs.
Yeah.
I was at a sermon at Sunday school one time, and the lady said, anybody thinks they ought to love everybody just hasn't met enough people. And I thought, this is the place for me, if you can say that out loud in a religious context, because it's real. And so, I don't think we're ever going to love everybody, agree with everybody, see things the same as everybody. But we can be generous in the way that we accept people into a large circle of friends and loved ones.
It's interesting. I often vacillate between the joys of culture and humanity and art and restaurants and all those wonderful things that we've created, and the absolute joy of being away from it all in the middle of nowhere. And it's very hard to figure out where the middle is.
Yes, and if you ask the question, which one of those is true experience, it's a ridiculous
Oh,
question. They're both true.
yeah.
And the more I think about this, I heard somebody say they went out with some people and they came back and said, we're all alike. We're all the same. Well, the answer is no, we're not. We are the same in lots of ways. We're different in lots of ways. Right. So here you get back to understanding a trade-off that universal things tend to be questionable. A friend of mine is a physician's assistant. He said there's 5 or 10% of people that will have an opposite reaction to a drug that everyone else does. Even in the science, they know that there's exceptions to the rules. So one size doesn't fit all, and I'm very distrustful of universalism.
I would say that culturally and experientially, we all are very different. But I would say the thing that we all have in common are our emotions. Now, I did a talk on isolation and connection with some people the other day. Isolation is something that probably most of us will feel at some point in our lives. It's almost part of the human condition. We're
Right.
never completely connected with another person. And I would argue that that's something we can all relate to. But when we start putting it into a cultural sense or an experiential sense, all of a sudden that's where the conflict arises. Are you isolated because you believe in this religion or you don't, because you believe in this party or you don't? And yet, why can't we drill down to the common experience, which I think would bind us?
You mentioned putting your feet in the water in nature. That's a feeling of isolation that I would cherish. And I think you did, is the way you described it, right? So isolation could be really wonderful, particularly when you've been overwhelmed in a connected society and you just need to get away. I understand some people in Silicon Valley buy log cabins up on a mountain with no phone, no Wi-Fi, nothing. They want to get back in touch with the earth. So there's a positive aspect of that, but I think you are probably referring more to isolation in the sense of loneliness and being
No,
cut off from people. Were you?
no, no, not at all. Isolation and loneliness are two different things because
Okay.
you can be isolated but not lonely.
Yes.
You can be lonely but not isolated.
Yeah. I could
Loneliness
agree with that.
is more
I like.
external.
Yeah. I've heard in the Myers Briggs archetype for personality types. It's a personality test some companies use to
Yeah.
determine how people operate. And the first one is extroverted or introverted. And extroverts get their energy from being around other people. Introverts have to spend their energy to be around other people and go recharge in isolation. So I accept your distinction between loneliness and isolation. What I wanted to say is that loneliness is not good. And when we cut ourselves off from other people because we don't disagree with them, we don't agree with them, that is seriously unfortunate and tragic, I think, in the end. So I think we do well to find ways to connect with people, even that we disagree with. And in the end, there's an opportunity to learn from them and they from us.
Yeah. I think loneliness comes down to seeking something external that you don't have, whereas isolation could, for some people, I'll say for myself, I love quiet. I
Yeah.
like being off on my own. I'm much more of a loner than I am a collective sort of person. I find enormous regeneration, say, in nature. And while I love going out for oysters and jazz, of the two, which is more fulfilling, it's probably that walk in the woods. But somebody else would say the exact opposite.
I love to be alone with a book. In a sense, I'm
Yeah.
not really alone. I have a low boredom threshold, and I just sitting around and nothing to do, I get bored really quickly. But I do like the sense of isolation where I'm not constantly interrupted and I can focus back to focus and sensitivity. I'm not constantly being asked to be sensitive to this or that. I can be alone with my book or with my thoughts in some events. So I think we need them both, and personalities certainly shape that widely. Some people need a lot more of one than the other.
I think personality and I also think experience
Right,
shapes that preference to a large degree and
right.
connection.
Yes,
Um, and your involvement with things. I think that energy, as you were saying earlier, that life is energy, and
yes,
that energy that you put out comes back to you in many different ways.
yes. That's right. There's such rich. I mean, the data that I've seen from experiments where people write about what makes tend to make people happy, that it's engagement, it's activity, not passivity.
Yeah,
Psychologists and social scientists say that, but I think common experience can tell us there's so much beauty to have in the world that it's incumbent on us to seize it, to engage in it as much as we can for the time that we've got. Of course, there's some people that are hurt by their experiences in the world. It's painful and they suffer, and they have probably a different point of view about engagement and enlargement. Uh, so that's what I'm thinking about and trying to understand.
I think we all hurt by the world. It's a matter of deciding what you're going to do with it. And how is that going to change you? How does it change your perspective? How does it impact your sense of compassion?
Right.
Because I think if you can find compassion, that's a game changer.
Yes. And it's a question of control. I was in a seminar the other day about people that write books, and if you want it to happen, you're responsible. You've got to do it. Don't expect anybody else to do it. It's a self determination kind of message. But then on the other hand, you have Kate Bowler, this fantastic faculty at Duke, divinity
Mhm.
school there, who developed stage 4 colon cancer in her early 30s and had 2 young children. And she rants against this idea that we're in control. She studies the prosperity gospel, which kind of says we're in control and God rewards us if we do certain things. She hates it. She says because that blames people who are unfortunate for their own predicament. And it's not like they did something wrong. They got a disease, they had an accident, pandemics are not in your control. And so she's very articulate about we have to accept these things that we're not in control. And it's not that God did it to us or any of that. It's the way the world is. And so it ends up with another trade-off between how much we think we're in control and how much we accept and we strive because we're in control, or how much we accept and acknowledge that that's not something we can change.
I think control is the ultimate illusion. And I think I say that partly from almost 15 years of flying. And I flew sailplanes, high-tech airplanes, no engine, right? So I
Yeah.
have to rely on invisible sources of lift to take me from point A to point B. And I think that all you can do is be intensely present, do your very best, and that might give you a sense of control. But I think there are forces, experiences, social interactions so much greater than any of us individually that control becomes an illusion, and you have to be careful that it doesn't control you.
I think in a grand sense, that's true. We are ultimately not in control and we have to accept a lot of things. I think where I would disagree with it is that we're in control of a lot of things. I'm going to choose what I do when I get up from this discussion, and I'm in control of that. And so, sometimes I'm told that I don't have free will, that everything's been predetermined, and that I'm just acting out some kind of plan. That's not acceptable to me because I know when I chose certain things, and so I resist the idea that I have no control, but I acknowledge that I'm not in ultimate control.
But I think you have choice, and choice also goes to discipline. For example, I have a pretty disciplined life. I get up at 4:30 so I can go walk in the morning before it gets hot. I have certain aspects of self care that are important to me. They are at the top of my list every day, and I go down and I check them off most days. That is, I guess, a sense of control, but I think
Yes,
it's also discipline that moves me towards my next goal and where I wanna be. I don't
yes,
have an answer for this. It's just that I think that as humans, we do our very best to control our environment, to, be part of our environment, and yet it's also experiential. We just have to show up, I think, sometimes and see where it takes us.
can I share a story with you about
Yeah.
this? Um, Long ago, I saw where Elaine Pagels was a guest of Bill Moyers on his television show. This 20 years ago, maybe 30, and she had a child with a serious illness that challenged her beliefs as a theologian. And she said, "What I ultimately determined was that I would rather be guilty than helpless." Because when people die, when bad things happen, they say, "Oh, this is God's plan. You can't understand it," or some things like
Mhm.
that. There's a reason for everything, which Kate Bowler rails against. There's not a reason for me getting cancer, in this situation. It's not something God wants. She puts in that religious language for a religious part of her life. But Elaine Pagels was looking at it from a psychological point of view that we need to have some feeling that there's some control over this. And so we may blame ourselves for something we really didn't do because at least it gives us agency that maybe if we change our behavior, it won't happen again tomorrow. If you just accept that this is completely beyond our control, this awful thing, the death of my child, has happened, if you don't find some way of understanding cause and effect where you could change the cause, change the outcome next time, you're lost. So maybe it's a crutch, maybe it's a psychological truth, but her way of articulating was, "I'd rather feel guilty than helpless."
I like that a lot. I know, I went through 6 years of on again, off again cancer treatment, and control was a huge aspect of this. What do I control in this utterly uncontrollable situation where the cancer just keeps coming back and coming back. And I ultimately decided that for me, I controlled what I thought, what I did, who I hung out with. And now I'm gonna have to search a little for the fourth one. It may have been connection, I think, connection with others. But I needed that sense of control, which was a sense of hope, really, in that
Yes.
situation,
Yes.
to just to deal with the entire thing. I could not be
Yes.
helpless.
Yes. That's right. I think that's powerful. And sometimes you have to go through really terrible things to come to that kind of realization. But it certainly can make the sunshine a lot brighter on the other side of it, right?
Well, and it goes back to energy and doing something. And I think that that's a really important point you make. We are we're here to in my the way I look at things, we're here to have a set of experiences. And my daily mantra is what can I learn?
Yes.
And I think of what can I learn as being a very energetic perspective on it, in that it makes me see things differently. It makes me think about things. It makes me perhaps make different choices. It makes me change my perspective sometimes. And I think all of that type of energy is a really interesting part of the human equation.
Sometimes I make menu choices that way when I can't decide. And I've had all of these, and I just pick something I haven't had because at least if I don't like it, at least I learned something.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
I explicitly think about choices in terms of finding ones that give me more information, so I'm smarter next time.
I have a saying, if I'm bored, it's because I'm becoming boring.
I used to tell my daughter that
Did you?
as a teenage, she'd come to me and say, Dad, I'm bored," and say, "It's because you're boring. You need to be interested in things. Look over there in the corner. That's kind of interesting thing that's going on with that bookshelf over there." Or a writing exercise I heard about one time. Somebody said they had writer's block. They couldn't think of what to say. And so the instructor kept narrowing the focus. Well, if you can't think of what to say about San Diego, talk about one neighborhood, talk about one street, talk about one building, talk about one brick, talk about the elements in that brick. The point was, if you think you don't have enough stimulation, you got to broaden. Maybe you just need to pay attention at an even more granular level because there's something there to pay attention to.